give you praise. I will praise your name, YaHuWaH, Elohim.
Shalom. In the previous lesson, we learned about the Rosh Chodesh, which literally translates into English as the head or the first, the beginning of the month, or literally the moon cycle. That word Chodesh, we discovered, means a monthly cycle. It is interchangeable with the Hebrew word Yerak, which means moon, throughout the Hebrew scriptures. Throughout the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, we see the examples, and we see the phrase Yerak Yamim, which means a moon of days, over and over and over throughout the scriptures. We also see the concept of counting with the moon in Shemoth and Exodus, when Musha, who is called Moses, his mother hid him for 3 moons, Shlosha Yerakim. It does not say Shlosha Chodeshim, which would literally mean 3 months, but it says Shlosha Yerakim, 3 moons. And this is very vital to understanding the calendar that Yahuwah Elohim has put forth for us to guard. We learned that that word Chodesh comes from the word Hadash. So the word month comes from the word to renew or to rebuild or to refurbish. That is what Hadash means. It not only means this, we learned that it also means to make something shine by polishing it. So it refers to the polishing of a sickle, literally a blade that is used for the gathering of the wheat and the barley and the fruits of the earth that would be presented to Yahuwah Elohim as bikurim, as first fruits. So these principles are very important to understand. Now we learned also that Shaul spoke of the new moons, the Rosh Chodeshim, in the book of Colossians chapter 2, verse 16. That he said, do not let anybody judge you according to the observations of the Sabbath, of the Shabbat, and of the new moons, and of the feast days. And he told us, he warned us against allowing anybody to say anything against us concerning the observation of these things, except for the body of Mashiach. Those were the ones who knew how they were to be observed and that they should be observed. And he says, don't let anybody judge you according to these things, except for the body of the Mashiach. For these things, he says clearly, these things are Tob things to come. They are great things that are coming. They are shadow pictures, is the exact wording that he used. Shadow pictures of great things to come. They are pointing to something great, something greater. We learned that all of these things that Yahuwah Elohim has put in the Shamayim are for signs. They are for seasons and appointed times. Throughout the scriptures, we see the importance and relevance. It is very basic teaching to understand that all principles must be established by 2 or 3 witnesses. And Yahuwah Elohim made 3 witnesses in the Shamayim that testify of this fact. The sun, the Shemesh, the moon, the Yerak, and the stars, the Kokabim. And so these things are very important to understand, because throughout the scriptures, we see that Yahuwah Elohim makes promises with his nation, with the nation of Yasharel, that if the ordinances of the sun, the moon, and the stars are to pass before me, if they stop, then the nation of Yasharel will stop before me. He makes promises and oaths that they will never, ever die fully. They will never be destroyed. There will always be a remnant as long as the sun, moon, and stars are in operation. Hallelujah. So he does all these things throughout the scriptures, and we see, for instance, Yosef, Yahusef, who is called Joseph. He has a dream, and in the dream he sees the sun, the moon, and the stars, and they bow down to him. And we know that the interpretation was that his father, his mother, and his brothers would bow to him, because he would go into Mitzrayim, and he would become the right-hand man of the Pharaoh because of his understanding of dreams and of visions. These are representations in the Shamayim of Yasharel, of the chosen nation, of the patriarchs, of the beginning, of the very message that Yahuwah Elohim is giving of redemption to mankind. And he placed them as signs and for seasons and appointed times and for days and years. And we should know these things. We need to acquaint ourselves with the understanding that is in the scriptures. Now, when Shaul referenced, who is called Paul, when he referenced the Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, if we go to Colossians in the Aramaic, in chapter 2, verse 16, we see that the wording there is the exact wording that would be in the Hebrew and the Abrit, except for in Hebrew it is pronounced Rosh Chodesh. In Aramaic it is pronounced Rosh Chodesha. And the difference, there is a slight difference. Rosha in Aramaic or Aramaic does not just mean the beginning and the chief and all these different things, but it literally refers to the top and tip of the head. And it also refers to the tip of the finger, referring to the fingernail. When you refer to the fingernail in the Aramaic language, you use the word Rosha. It refers to the tip of your finger. And we all know that the fingernail is literally seen in the Shamayim when we see that thin crescent that begins, that thin sliver that begins, the very first one, the rebuilding of the month, the rebuilding of the moon. Because Yahuwah Elohim put lights in the Shamayim. And also in Aramaic or Aramaic, Rosha also literally means the tip and edge of a blade. So we're talking about something that you can see. If you were to tell a child, don't touch the Rosha on the blade, the edge of the blade, they can see that. They know that. That's something that they can see. You know, it's something that can be observed. The tip of the finger, if you tell a child in Aramaic, you speak to them about the Rosha of their finger, they're going to know exactly what you're talking about because they can see it. The top of the head, Rosha, again, they're going to know it. These are simple things that children would understand. The same goes for Hebrew even. However, in Hebrew, I have not found any references literally to the fingernail. However, in Aramaic, we see it clearly. These are two different languages. They are sister languages. They are very much related. So it is very important to note this fact, because when he was translating this over, he was given this from Hebrew, because he spoke Hebrew, Abrit. Even according to the Aramaic sources, Shaul spoke Abrit, Hebrew. When he was translating this message over to the Arameans, they would have learned that it was that sliver in the moon, because that's what it means in the language. So let us go to Bereshith, chapter 1, verse 14, to highlight a very important picture that we went through very thoroughly in the previous lesson. We're not going to examine it as thoroughly this time. We're just going to read through it to reacquaint ourselves with the importance of what Yahuwah Elohim is telling us in this passage. This is on the very first page of the scriptures. There's a lot of information, very critical information, that can be found on the very first page of the scriptures. In chapter 1, verse 14, we read, "And Elohim said, let lights come to be in the expanse of the Shamayim, the heavens, to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs." We learned that that was Othot. "And for appointed times." That is Moedim. The appointed times of Yahuwah are called Moedim. The Othot, the signs, which is in the singular, is spelled Aleph Tav, a picture of the Mashiach, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. It's the first and the last of the Hebrew and the Aramaic languages, Aleph and Tav. And so this is a picture of the light. Again, he appointed, it's going to tell us here that he appointed the lights. Let lights come to be in the expanse. So he did not say let the darkness come to be. There was already darkness. And Elohim said let lights come to be in the expanse of the Shamayim to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs. So it's the lights that are the oath, the Othot, and appointed times, the Moedim, and for days and for years. So the lights in the Shamayim, the three great witnesses in the Shamayim. Again, a picture of Yasharel in the Shamayim. There are 12 constellations that the sun passes through in the ecliptical plane. People, pagans, have called this zodiac. It means a wheel of stars. In the Hebrew scriptures, however, we see that the word for this is Mazzaroth, which refers to the circuit in which the sun goes through the stars, literally. And so we know that Yahuwah Elohim has put even the stars for the appointed times, and the sun and the moon. They must all work together, because he says this. He says that he put them there for this reason, right here in verse 14. And it says, and let them be for lights in the expanse of the Shemaim. So it's going to be something we can see. The signs, if there is darkness for the moon, that does not a sign of life. For instance, the idea also of Rosh Chodesh is the birthing of a child. When the child comes forth, when his head comes forth, we call that crowning. This is what Rosh Chodesh also refers to, the crowning, the head, crowning of the head, the light. It shows a picture of that child coming forth. And we all know that when the child comes forth, and when you can hold the child and see the child, there's great rejoicing. Everyone rejoices over the life of the child because they can see the light of the child. They can see this beautiful child that Yahuwah Elohim has provided. And this is the picture in the Shemaim. It's also a picture of the Mashiach who grew up as a tender plant, as the scriptures speak of, is that first visible crescent that begins to shoot up. And then as it grows, we see its esteem, the esteem that comes forth from the Son, which is Yahuwah Elohim. And it fills Yahushua HaMashiach, that picture of the Yerach in the Shemaim. And then we see that the life of the moon begins to be cut off and it begins to wane. And then it is no more. That is the picture of Yahushua being laid in the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights. The moon cannot be seen in the Middle East from anywhere from 1.5 days to 3.5 days. It is a literal picture of the resurrection of the Aleph Tau, of the oath of the Mashiach. So these things are very important to comprehend. It's talking about the birthing of the head, the crowning of the head, that first visible sign of the head when we all rejoice, and the sounding of the trumpets. And Yahuwah Elohim has appointed it for a time of simcha, a time of rejoicing. So it's really, really important and vital to understand that Yahuwah made these lights for this reason. It says, let them be for lights in the expanse of the Shemaim, something that we're going to be able to see, to give light on the earth. And it came to be so. So not only are there going to be this oath, because again, remember, the lights are an oath. There are oathot, they are signs. If it's not only signs in the Shemaim, but it's going to shine upon the earth. It's going to bring an oath, a sign upon the earth. And what would that be? It would be the fact that Yahuwah Elohim has created what we know to be the 4 seasons. There are 4 seasons that point to the picture of Yahuwah's name that has been referred to as the Tetragrammaton, which literally means the 4 letters. We know that Yahuwah Elohim, his name is a picture embedded throughout the creation. We have talked about this many, many, many times already, that Yahuwah Elohim has put in this world a picture of creation that comes from the hand, the Yad, which is the first letter of his name. And then we see that the hand puts forth into motion life. And that is the picture of the Hay. The Hay in the pictograph is shown as a man with his arms outstretched. This is a Shemitic pictographic source. And we know that this is a very reliable tool because in the actual modern Hebrew, the word Hay means to behold. And that is what the picture is doing. Also, Yod, the first letter, is Yad. It means a hand. So it's hand, behold. Then we see the Wah, which Wah is pronounced Vav in modern Hebrew, but there was no V in the ancient Abrit in the Hebrew. However, this word, whether it's pronounced Wah or Vav, however you want to pronounce it, this word literally means nail. Doesn't matter. That's the literal meaning. It is the nail. And so it's hand, behold, nail, and then we have the behold, the man appears at the end. These are a picture we see of the seasons of the year. During the time of spring, there is life, there is a sign on the earth, the plants begin to rise. Again, this is a picture, again, of the beginning of the month. Because, for instance, when you plant the seed in the darkness, which is a picture of the darkness of the moon, for instance, there is no sign that you are going to have a plant until you see the beginning of this sprout come forth. That is the time of rejoicing. That is the time of announcing. You tell people, oh yeah, look at these plants. They're coming forth. This is amazing. This is excellent. This is when you begin to rejoice. Because if the seed, many of us know who plant seed, if they don't come up, there's no reason for rejoicing. They're just going to lay there, you know. Sometimes they'll come up way later. But the point is that when it's seen, the sign upon the earth is the sprouting. We call this in our modern culture, we refer to this time frame as the time of spring. Okay, so it is around this time frame when the plants begin to come back to life. Those early plants, I mean, they're already alive, but the picture is supposed to be that they're coming back to life. They're actually dormant. So, but what they're doing is they're reviving. It's a picture of resurrection. They looked to be dead. They lost all their leaves, you know, well, except for the evergreens, of course. But the majority, we see they went through this phase of, it looked like they were dying, and we went through this harsh time of coldness, and you know, it's like almost like death. And then all of a sudden, here's life again in the spring, right? This is really important. He created the lights so that we can see. They're going to be visible signs in the Shamayim, but they're going to make a visible sign on the earth. This is what it's talking about when he says that he made the lights for the signs, for the seasons, for the days, for the years, and he also made them to give light al ha'aretz, upon the land of the earth. All right, and it says, and to rule over the day, the yom, and over the night, the Laila, and to separate the light from the darkness. And Elohim saw that it was tov. And there came to be evening, which is Ereb, and there came to be morning, which is Boker, the fourth day, or Yom Ha'arba. So, the day of the fourth. It's very important to understand that Yahuwah Elohim has told us how to calculate a day. We've already gone through this. Always throughout the beginning of Bereshith and throughout the scriptures, you will see that Yahuwah Elohim tells us to begin our Shabbatot, our Sabbaths, and to begin our days in the Ereb, in the evening, which is the time of the mixture, when the sun and the moon are begin to come to a point where, you know, the night is coming in and the sun is waning. Basically, what we're saying is the sun will set, and then all of a sudden, night will come to be. And what you'll see in the western sky as the sun is setting is that there will be these beautiful colors. Yahuwah made these beautiful colors for this time, reds and blues and violets and indigos, all these different beautiful colors that Yahuwah has put in the Shamayim. And as this begins to happen, all of a sudden, about 15 minutes as the sun has set, in 15 minutes or so, the Kokabim, the stars, will begin to appear. And when you see 2 to 3 stars in the Shamayim, you have declared that clearly this is the beginning of the next day, because this is what Ereb, mixture, literally refers to. That's what the word Ereb, or evening, means. It does not mean evening as in even portions. It means Ereb, which means a mixture of the day and of the night, because there's still, even though the sun has set, you cannot see it any longer, you can still see the beautiful colors that it is displaying. You can still see the fading of its light. So the light is a part of the Yom, this time period. And then it goes into the night, and then we have the Boker, because it says in the Hebrew scriptures, YaHuWaH, and it existed to be Ereb, the mixture, YaHuWaH, and it existed to be Boker, which is the morning. And then it says always, you know, whatever day it was, the first day, the second day, the third day, the fourth day, on and on and on. This is the pattern. This is the clear pattern. And we know that that sliver of the moon that begins the Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of our months, is at the time where we see the moon at the setting of the sun. We talked about this earlier, that when the sun sets, you will see that first sliver, and you will see it the very first time for 15 to 20, 30 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, but usually for a very short period of time before it sets. And then, you know, the next night it becomes a little thicker and it stays in the sky a little longer, and then it sets, and then so on and so forth. And you have your full moon, and then you have the time of your dark moon, which can last 1.5 to 3.5 days. But the point of this is because the new moon is always seen at the very moment of the Ereb. As soon as the sun sets and the time frame of the stars begin to shine, that is when the Yerach begins to shine at the time of the Rosh Chodesh, at the beginning of a day, clearly. So now we know, we obviously know, we've gone through all of this. We know when the beginning of the month is. So now let us go over to the base text of this entire series and refresh ourselves with the idea of the beginning of the year. Because after all, we are reading the entirety of Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 23 in this series. So we're going to go back and just refresh on why this is important. If we go to chapter 23, we've already read verses 1 through 5 already, but we're going to go back to verse 5 again. It says, in the first new moon, in the first Chodesh, on the 14th Yom, the 14th day of the Chodesh, of the new moon or of the month, between the evenings, Bein Ha'arabim, between those times of the mixtures in the Shamayim, between the Arabim is the Pesach, the Passover, YaHuWaH, unto Yahuwah. That is when the Passover is to be observed. So to observe the Pesach and all of the feast, may I add, all the feast hinge on this very critical moment in time. We must accurately know when the beginning of our year is. Okay, now let's go to Shemoth, Exodus chapter 12, verse 2, and let us allow the scriptures to interpret this for us, because Yahuwah is very clear in his scriptures. In Shemoth, Exodus chapter 12, verse 2, in the Torah, written by Moshe, who is called Moses, chapter 12, verse 2, this month is the beginning of months, the Rosh HaShana. The Rosh HaShana refers to the chief, the beginning point, the first of the months. So the beginning of the year is going to be the beginning of a month. In other words, you're going to have to see that sliver to start your year. But now we have to know which one, because we have to know, when does the year start? How does it start? What does the Torah say? Let's allow Yahuwah's word to speak for itself. This month is the beginning, the Rosh HaShana, the beginning of your months, the head of your months, the chief point of all the months. For you, it is the first Chodesh of the Shana, of the year for you. It is the first renewal of the monthly cycle. Again, Chodesh comes from Hadash, which means to renew and to rebuild. The rebuilding of the light. Yahuwah put the lights for the signs, for the seasons, for the appointed times. And so we are looking for the rebuilding of light upon the moon. This is what it's speaking about, the beginning point. But this is the chief point. And this is important because it says, speak to all the congregation of Yasharel, saying, on the 10th day of this Chodesh, each one of you is to take for himself a lamb according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. So this is obviously speaking of the Pesach, the Passover. 4 days later, from the 10th day, on the 14th, Bein Ha'arabim, between the evenings, the mixtures, the sacrifice of the lamb is slaughtered. And in the evening, going into the 15th, which is the Chag, the festival of Hamatzot, the matzah, the unleavened bread, this is when the Pesach, the Passover, is to be consumed in the evening, because Yahuwah Elohim told them to eat this in the evening, and he brought them out of Mitzrayim by night. We know this. We're going to go through this later in the section on the Pesach. But just so we know, this is definitely talking about Passover. So to know the timing of Yahuwah Elohim's prophetic feast days that point to the great things that are to come, you have to know the beginning of the year and the beginning of the moon, the beginning of the month. And they have to work together. We're going to talk about this and how they work together in just a moment. In Shemoth, Exodus chapter 13, verse 3, and Moshe said to the people, remember this day in which you went out of Mitzrayim, out of the house of slavery. For by strength of hand, by strength of Yad, the very first letter of Yahuwah's name is Yod. It is actually pronounced Yad, and it means hand. By strength of the hand, by strength of the Yad, Yahuwah brought you out of this place, and whatever is leavened shall not be eaten. Today you are going out in the month of Abib. That is how it reads in the scriptures version. Now, in the Hebrew scriptures, it says, Hayom atim yotzim b'chodesh ha'abib. Hayom means the day. Atem, to you, yotzim, you're going out. B'chodesh, in the chodesh, or in the monthly cycle, in the moon cycle, ha'abib, in the abib. Ha'abib, literally, the definite article ha means is speaking of the Abib, not just a month, but a literal time period of Abib. Now, what does Abib mean? It means the tender heads that form on the cereal grain, specifically speaking of the barley. That is one of the early crops that take place and begin to sprout up in the earth before the other crops do in the land of Yasharel, in the land of Israel. So this is really important to understand because here we see the agricultural aspect. Because Abib is literally agricultural. And we see witnesses in the Torah that tell us that Abib is always agricultural. For instance, Yahuwah Elohim requires of the Bikurim, the first fruits. And he specifically speaks that he wants the Abib to be his first fruits, his Bikurim. And that it is the Abib, it is the green heads of the barley from Yasharel that is brought forth and waved as the wave sheaf that takes place on the morrow after the Shabbat, after the Sabbath. This is all in the scriptures. So this is really important because not only do we see the Abib here, but let us remember, Chodesh also, again, means to refurbish and to polish and to make shine, referring to literally the blade that is on a sickle that is used for harvesting, literally, grains such as barley. So Yahuwah Elohim is sending a message. Remember, the othot, the signs, the literal word sign can mean so many things in Hebrew. It can mean message. It is literally telling us something. We see that the Yarak, the moon, is showing us the sign of the harvest of the Bikurim, of the first fruits. Specifically talking about the Chodesh HaAbib, the renewal or the cycle of the Abib, because this is what's going to happen. So we know that this is a sign in the Shamayim because Yahuwah Elohim is reminding us that we must present to him our first fruits, our Bikurim. Yahuwah Elohim requires of us our first and our best, and he deserves our absolute best. And so we must know the timing of this is very crucial to understanding the prophetic time frame that you live in this generation in these last days. Let us allow the Torah to define the word Abib for us. If we go to Shemot, to Exodus chapter 9, verse 31, we will see an excellent example. And this is the time that Yahuwah had just poured out the plague of hail upon the land of Mitzrayim, which today is called Egypt. And it reads, and the flax and the barley were smitten. For the barley was in the head, and the flax was in the bud. Now here the phrase, the barley was in the head, is literally Hasorah Abib. Hasorah means the barley. Abib means a time of the ripening of the tender heads of the green barley. So here literally we see Hasorah and Abib, the barley and Abib tied together in the scriptures. So Abib is barley literally, but it is a specific time frame in the growth and development of the barley. And if we go further in the Torah to Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 2, verse 14, we will get some more specific information about the Abib. It says, and if you bring a grain offering of your Bikurim, of your first fruits, to Yahuwah, bring for the grain offering of your first fruits green heads. Here in the Hebrew, the Abrit, we see that the word green heads is one word, and it is Abib. Again, the word Abib appears. So Yahuwah wants our first fruits, the first fruits of our barley in the stage of the green head, in the stage of the Abib. Now here we get some more information about Abib. It says, of grain roasted on the fire, crushed heads of new grain. Now, I know that we do not live currently in a very agricultural society, and many people do not grow barley, but if you research the barley, or if you actually do happen to grow the barley, you would see and learn that when the barley begins to turn green, that for the first 2 weeks it is filled with a milky liquid substance. If you went to squeeze the heads, literally the milk could come out of the tender head. And if you went to parch this on fire, this milky substance would evaporate and the heads would wilt and there would be nothing there that you could literally consume and have as a food. But if you wait 2 weeks after this point, that milky substance will begin to solidify. And if you squeezed it, you would feel that it's very, very firm. And you can roast these heads on the fire and consume the product after. And it is a very tasty snack that is used throughout the Mediterranean region where Israel, where Yisrael just happens to be. So they are very familiar with this concept already. But here we get very specific about the barley, about the Abib literally. See, the Torah has laid the entire groundwork of our understanding here. We have gone throughout the Torah and defined the new moon and defined the new month and defined the new year, and now we see clearly that it's all based agriculturally around the Abib. YaHuWaH has commanded us that we must bring before him the grain of our first fruits. And literally, he wants the barley. Now, we know specifically that Abib is barley and that it is speaking of a specific time in the development of the barley. You don't want to bring it too early, too young, because that won't work. That will not be a sufficient first fruit offering. If you bring it too late, the barley will have already gone to seed. So if you wait too many weeks, you will not have first fruits anymore. But YaHuWaH has said he wants the green heads. So we have to be immediate in our response to the ripening of the barley. So we are supposed to be looking for this sign that the sun will create on the earth by bringing warmth and longer days to the earth, therefore making the time frame of Abib when the barley can sprout and turn green. Now, if we go further to Shemoth 23, verse 15, it says, guard the festival of unleavened bread. 7 days you eat unleavened bread, as I commanded you at the time appointed in the month of Abib. For in it you came out of Mitzrayim, and do not appear before me empty-handed. Now, YaHuWaH has warned you, and he has said, do not appear before him empty-handed. To appear before YaHuWaH empty-handed is to do a very grievous sin. We know that the scriptures have told us in the book of Yehukanan and John, 1 John chapter 3, verse 4, that sin is the breaking of the Torah. So therefore, one who comes before YaHuWaH empty-handed has sinned before him, and not only has he sinned before him, he has done a very tragic thing before YaHuWaH, because we are to rejoice before our Creator with the first fruits of our substance. We are supposed to wave these sheaves of barley before him and to give him todah, or thanks. And this is to show that we are grateful to our Creator who gives us the rain in its proper season, because he said that he would give us the rain if we would only keep his ways and guard his Torah, that he would give us the berakoth, the blessings, that's what people call them, but literally the gifts that he gives us for honoring his way and honoring his commandments. So we are not to appear before YaHuWaH empty-handed. And if you read the scriptures, you will know that whenever YaHuWaH says do not do something, you better not do whatever he is telling you not to do. Because the one who does the thing that YaHuWaH says do not do, there is always a consequence. There is always going to be a reaction from YaHuWaH. There will be a price to pay. So this is a very weighty piece of scripture that lets us know for sure that our new year must indeed transpire during the time of Abib. We have to have Abib to begin the year because we cannot appear before YaHuWaH, the creator of the heavens and the earth, empty-handed. And not only do we see this, but we also see that it says literally that we are to do this at the time appointed in the month of Abib. In the Hebrew and the Abrit, it says, Lamoed Chodesh HaAbib. Moed literally means unto the appointed time. Again, we're speaking of appointed times of YaHuWaH. Lamoed, his appointed times. Chodesh, the moon cycle, or the month, literally, HaAbib. So we know that the time of the Abib, the month of the Abib, is an appointed time. It is a special time. Lamoed Chodesh HaAbib. It is unto the appointed time of the new moon within the time frame of Abib. So here we get the formula, literally, that we are looking for an appointment that happens with the Chodesh appearing during the time of the ripening of the green barley heads, HaAbib, the Abib. Now if we go on over to Shemoth, Exodus chapter 34, verse 18. Guard the festival of unleavened bread. For 7 days you eat unleavened bread, as I commanded you. In the appointed time, here again, in the Moed of the month, the Chodesh HaAbib, of the Abib. Because in the month of Abib, in the Chodesh Abib, you came out from Mitzrayim. So here we see that Abib is a picture of our freedom. It is a picture of life. Everything begins to come back to life. The seeds begin to sprout. The trees begin to put on their leaves and to bring forth their fruits and their flowers. A picture of overcoming death. A picture of the resurrection. A picture of the Mashiach, the Messiah, who sets us free from Mitzrayim. And we know that this time of the spring of Abib is a picture of this very fact. It is an appointment. It is an appointed time. It is a prophetic picture. As Shaul said, the new moons and the festival days are shadows of great things that are coming. It's a picture of the world that is to come as well. Because we know that the winter is a picture of tribulation, a picture of hardship. But then during the spring, there is new life. And this is a picture, again, of Yahuwah's world that is to come, his eternal Shabbat. So we honor these times that point to his great name, that point to his esteem, and that point to the life that he has given us on this earth. In Devarim, Deuteronomy 16, verse 6, guard the month of Abib and perform the Pesach, the Passover, to YaHuWaH, your Elohim. For in the month of Abib, in the Chodesh HaAbib, YaHuWaH, your Elohim, brought you out of Mitzrayim by night. Here in Hebrew, we know that we've already looked at this before, and it says, Shamar et Chodesh HaAbib. Shamar literally means to look for and to observe and to watch over and to look narrowly for. Et is the Aleph and the Taw, the first and the last of the Hebrew and the Aramaic language. And we know this is a picture of the Messiah, the Mashiach, the first and the last. And also this word is sometimes pronounced oath, which literally means a sign. So we are looking for a sign, looking for a picture. Shamar et Chodesh HaAbib, looking for the Chodesh, the renewal of the moon cycle, HaAbib, in the Abib, literally, during the time of the Abib. So we're supposed to be looking for the sign of the month in Abib. But we can look at this in another way because Chodesh and Chadash are written the same way. So it can read Shamar, look for, and guard and search for, et, the sign, the Aleph Taw, the Chadash, the renewal, HaAbib, of the Abib. So it is a time of the renewing of the Abib as well. So we are supposed to be looking for not only the Hodesh, which is the new moon, the first sliver in the sky, a picture of the harvesting of the barley, but we're supposed to also be looking for the barley as well. Shamar et Hodesh HaAbib. Look for and guard and search for the oath, the Aleph Taw, the sign and the renewing in the moon cycle of the Abib, literally. So these all work together. We are supposed to be searching for the barley in the land of Yasharel because we are not to appear before our Creator empty-handed. Again, it is a very grievous sin to do so. Now, why is all of this important? All of this is important because there is a great controversy in the calendar. The calendar of the scriptures that YaHuWaH has put forth in the creation works off of the sun, moon, and stars, the three witnesses in the Shamayim. Now, the reason all of this is important is because there is a controversy within the calendar, and it's confused many people. You see, a solar year is made up of 365 days. The book of Enoch or Hanuk references the solar year and says that it's 364 days because of a method that it uses to intercalculate the year. And a lunar year is made up of 354 days at a minimum. And the book of Enoch also refers to this fact. And we know that these 2 years must synchronize with each other. The sun and the moon must work together to give us a year. But there is a lot of confusion because of this fact, because if you subtract 365 days from the solar year, from the 354 days of the lunar year, you will see that the lunar year loses 11 days every single year. In 3 years' time, you will have lost an entire month, an entire moon of days, and also 3 days. So you have to do something because you cannot observe the Passover in the wintertime. And YaHuWaH has commanded that we cannot appear before him empty-handed. And if we start our year too early, for instance, we will obviously appear before him empty-handed, and we will be observing our Passover in the wintertime, which we are forbidden to do. The Pesach, the Passover, must happen during the time frame that we today refer to as spring, when the Abib, the barley, is in the tender head and can be roasted with fire for a first fruits offering. So we cannot allow this to happen. We see an example of this in the Islamic calendar. On the Islamic calendar, you will see, for instance, Ramadan. And Muslims can celebrate Ramadan throughout the entire seasons of the year. Because it is affixed to a lunar-only calendar, they have 354 days on the calendar. So every single year, they're losing 11 days. And so therefore, all of their celebrations can cycle throughout the year because there's a loss of 11 days every single year. But we cannot allow this to happen because YaHuWaH has said that all of his appointed festivals must happen in their appointed times and in their seasons. So Passover, Pesach, has to happen at a specific time frame. So we have to do something here. What has to happen is that a month of days, which is literally 29.5, about 30 days, a moon cycle of days has to be added to the calendar. This would give you 13 months every 2 or 3 years. What this will do is it will fix the calendar. It will make the sun and moon work together so that there is no loss of time. There will never be 14 months, only 13. And if you do this every single time, it will always work. This is what YaHuWaH has commanded because the scriptures say, Asa Yerak le Moedim. He appointed and created and celebrated the Yerak, the moon, for the appointed times, for his festival days. Very, very important to understand that if YaHuWaH appointed the moon, and we have to use the moon because he has declared that it is a measurement of time, there has to be an additional 13th month sometimes, so that we do not celebrate Passover in the wintertime, because we are losing those 11 days every year. So this, again, is important because some have pointed out that they do not see this mentioned in the Torah. But again, when YaHuWaH says that he appointed the moon for the appointed times, and all of these appointed times have to happen in their seasons, he is telling us literally that something has to be done. And this fixes itself if you go by the observation of the barley. If you just wait for the observation of the barley will naturally sometimes add an additional moon of days, an additional month to the calendar, so that you can observe the first fruits and all of the offerings to YaHuWaH in their appointed seasons. But again, this has to happen. And some have got confused about this, but it is in the scriptures. YaHuWaH has commanded us to do this when he commanded us to use the moon for the appointed times. He knew that they were off from one another, and there must be synchronization to bring us all of the festival days within the year. So again, every 2 or 3 years, an additional month will be added. So every 2 or 3 years, you will have a 13th month, and you will call that year a leap year because of the adding of the month of days to the calendar. It is called a leap year. Okay, now let's look at some examples in history about the Abib, literally, and the spotting of Abib to begin our year. Because some have pointed out that the Karaites, the modern Karaites, observe the barley in the land of Israel, and so somehow this must be a tradition of man. Surely they couldn't have had something right. But that is very off from reality. If we know the proper history of the scriptures, we know that all of the sects within Yasharel at the time of the Mashiach knew and observed the ripening of the barley because it had to be brought to the house of YaHuWaH as a wave sheaf offering. People pointed out that the Sadducees also did this. And so because the Sadducees looked for barley to begin their year, again, it must somehow be a tradition. Surely the Sadducees wouldn't have had anything right. That's the mentality that people have today. However, it must be understood that the Sadducees are actually called Zadokim in Hebrew. They are the sons of Zadok, which are a priestly class of the Kohanim that would serve YaHuWaH in his house. So surely they understood the principles of the offerings, and that is why they use this method. But I want to use an example in the Babylonian Talmud to show that also the Pharisees observed this as well to begin their years. Because the Karaites and the Zadokim, the Sadducees, outright reject the Talmud and do not use it at all. They may use it today for some historical reasons to just research various principles and things like that, but they do not use it as scripture as the Pharisees do. And in the first century, the Sadducees, the Zadokim, wouldn't have used it at all. But let us look at what the Pharisees were doing. It says, it once happened that Rabban Gamliel, now we learned about Rabban Gamliel in the previous lesson, in Rosh Chodesh. We learned that Shaul said that he was a Pharisee. He said, men, brothers, I am a Pharisee. And I learned at the feet of Gamliel the exactness of the Torah of our fathers. Shaul accredited his teacher, Gamaliel, as to teaching him the exactness or the perfection of the Torah. He did not say, I learned a bunch of traditions of men. I learned a bunch of Talmud. I learned a bunch of nonsense from this man. He says, no, I learned the exactness of the Torah. So he learned about the observation of the new moon, of the new year, of all the festivals, and he learned it from Gamaliel. So this means that if he believed that Gamaliel taught him the exactness of Torah, what we are about to read must agree with the exactness of Torah, because we're reading about what Rabban Gamaliel, who is Shaul's personal teacher, did at this time period. It says it once happened that Rabban Gamaliel, again Shaul's teacher, was sitting on a step on the Temple Mount, and the well-known scribe YaHuWaH was standing before him with 3 cut sheets of parchment lying before him. And he, Gamaliel, said to him, take the 3rd sheet and write to our brethren, our brothers, the exiles of Babylon, and to those in Media, and to all the other exiled of Yasharel, saying, may your shalom, may your peace be great forever. We beg to inform that the doves are still tender, and the lambs are still young, and the Abib is not yet ripe. It seems advisable to me and my colleagues to add 30 days, or a Yerak Yamin, a moon of days, to the calendar. So here we see clearly that the president of the Sanhedrin, who was Shaul's personal teacher, believed in using the Abib. And not only this, we learn many things from this one example. For instance, we learn that Rabban Gamaliel had letters wrote by YaHuWaH the scribe that were going to the exiles who were still in Babylon. Many people don't realize that there were many Yahudim who never went back to the land, that they stayed in Babylon for the last 2,000 years up till modern times. So this is very important to understand, because not only is he writing a letter to the exiles, but he's letting them know that the Abib has not yet been found. So therefore, he does not want the exiles to begin to observe the first of the month yet. And not only this, but we know that during this time period, when the new moon would be spotted, they would make signal fires from mountaintop to mountaintop, all the way to the land of Babylon and all the way to the lands of Media, so that the exiles, those who had been exiled out of their lands, could know when the new moon was. They weren't going off the observation from Babylon. They weren't going off the Abib in Babylon. They were going off of the Abib and the Chodesh, the new moon that would be found in the land. When you were in the land, you could observe it from the land. And this is because the Torah must go forth from Zion, from Mount Zion, and the law from Yerushalayim. This is the word of YaHuWaH himself. So it is very, very interesting when we look at history, because history solidifies what the Torah has already taught. We see that all of these men and all these different sects, the Pharisees, the Zadokим, even the modern Karaites, they all do this because it is in the Torah. It is not a tradition of man. Yes, they do. These groups do traditions of men as well, but this is in the Torah. And when it's in the Torah, you cannot call it a tradition. YaHuWaH has said to shamar the Chodesh HaAbib, to look for the Chodesh and the Abib literally. Another example in the Bavli Sanhedrin 11b reads, our rabbis taught based on 3 things is the year intercalculated: on the Abib, on the fruits of the trees, and on the Tukufah. The word Tukufah is a Hebrew word which means circuit, referring to the circuit of the 4 seasons that happen throughout the year. Based on 2 of them, the year is intercalculated. But based on 1 of them alone, the year is not intercalculated. And when the Abib is one of them, everyone is pleased, because everyone knows that the month of Abib has to have Abib. Therefore, they're looking for the Abib. That is the major principal sign. But all three of these signs that the Pharisees were using during this time period were agricultural. We see they were looking for the ripened heads of barley, which are Abib. They were looking for the fruits of the trees. They knew that there were certain fruits of the trees that should be sprouting during this time period. And they were also looking for the Tekufah of the year, the seasons of the year to change. They were looking for the beginning of what we would know to be spring. So all three of them were based to the agriculture of the land. Let's go further and look at this word Tekufah in the scriptures, because many people have said that we should use the Tekufah to begin our year. But the reality is the Torah does not say that anywhere. And there are no passages in the scriptures that do say that. But we want to look at it because Tekufah is important. The word Tekufah means, again, the circuit or the cycle, referring to, in this portion, it was referring to the year. But it can be a circuit or cycle of anything, just about. If we look at Tehillim, Psalm chapter 19, verse 4, it says, their line has gone through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them he set up for a tent for the sun. And it is like a bridegroom coming out of his room. It rejoices like a strong man to run the path. Now pause just a moment. This is speaking about literally the sun passing through the 12 constellations which go across the ecliptical plane. These have been called the zodiac. In Hebrew, it is the word Mazaroth, and it refers to the circle of the stars. And this could be considered to be a Tekufah by itself, because there is a circuit that happens that the sun passes through the tents or the houses of the Mazaroth, what people have called the zodiac. But if we continue reading in verse 6, it says, its rising is from one end of the heavens. The rising of the sun is from one end of the heavens, and its Tekufah, its circuit, to the other end, and nothing is hidden from its heat. So here the word Tekufah only means the idea of the circuit of a day, not the circuit of a year, not even the circuit or Tekufah of the Mazaroth. But here the example is clearly speaking of the Tekufah being the rising and setting of the sun, the path that it goes, the circuit that it goes through. So this passage does not tell us to begin our year with Tekufah. And neither is the next verse. Another example of Tekufah can be found in Exodus, Shemoth, chapter 34, verse 22. And perform the festival of weeks, the Shavuot, for yourself of the firstfruits of wheat harvest, and the festival of ingathering at the turn of the year. Here we see the phrase Tekufat HaShanah. Tekufat, the circuit, HaShanah, of the year, or the turn of the year, as it has been translated. But let us notice that the idea of Tekufah here in this passage is referring to the concept of the ingathering and of the gathering of the wheat harvest. So again, the idea of Tekufah is agricultural, according to the Torah. In Shemoth, in Exodus 23:16, it says, and the feast of ingathering at the going out of the year. Here the word Tekufah has been replaced with the word set, which means the going out of. So Tekufah and set are interchangeable. In Exodus 34:22, we saw Tekufat HaShanah. But now in Exodus 23:16, we see Set HaShanah, the going out of the year. When you have gathered in your work from the field. So the going out of the year happens when we have gathered in our fruit from the field. Again, the idea of the Tekufah and the idea of the Set, the going out of the year, is literally talking about the ending of the agricultural season. Now, if we go over to Deuteronomy 16:13, it says, you shall keep the feast of booths for 7 days, when you have gathered in from your threshing floors and from your wine presses. So again, we see that this whole time frame of observation has to do with what we are growing and what we are reaping. In 2 Chronicles 24:23, and it was at the circuit, this word is Tekufa, of the year, so Tekufa HaShanah, that the army of Aram went up, and they came to Yehuda and Yerushalayim. We can read about this same exact example in 1 Kings 20, verse 26. And it says, and it was the return of the year. Previously said it was the Tekufa HaShanah. Now it says it's the return of the year. That is Teshuvah HaShanah, which literally means the repenting or the turning away of the year. Literally, Teshuvah HaShanah. And Ben-Hadad counted Aram and went up to Aphek to war with Yasharel, with Israel. In 2 Shemuel, chapter 11, verse 1, it says, and it was the Teshuvah HaShanah, the return of the year again. At the time the kings go out to war, and David sent Joab, and they smote the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. So here we see the idea of the Teshuvah, which is interchangeable with the Tekufa, is specifically a time of the year that the kings go out to battle. And we know that the kings go out to battle during the time when there is enough produce for the armies to eat so that they can have the energy to fight the war, to fight the battles. So again, all of the examples that are related to Tekufa in the Hebrew Scriptures tell us literally that it's speaking of the seasons, the growing seasons. Never do we see it mentioned as anything other than this, except for in the example of 1 Shemuel 1, verse 20. And it says, and it was at the Tekufot Yamim, the Tekufot, the circuits of the days. And Hannah conceived and bore a son. So here the idea of Tekufot is literally speaking of the circuit of the days. She had finished the cycle of her pregnancy, and now she was bringing forth a son. So here we see that Tekufa, again, can be any type of circuit. But when it's used for the Tekufa of the year, it's talking about the idea of what is being grown and reaped in the land. Because again, the calendar is very agricultural. Now, in all the examples of the word Tekufa in the Hebrew Scriptures, we see that the word means a circuit or a cycle, literally. But there is some confusion that has come about in modern times because there are those who have suggested that the word Tekufa must mean equinox, referring to the equinox that takes place in the spring and also in the fall, and suggesting that this must be the circuit of the year. But the Scriptures, the Torah, never told us to look for or guard or search for the circuit. Never does it say to shamar the Tekufa, but it says to shamar at Chodesh HaAviv, to look for and guard the new moon that happens during the time of the ripening of the barley. So we know that this is referring to the Tekufa, the circuit or cycle of ingathering, as we see in Torah, because the Torah has given us the definition. We cannot change it. Nowhere are we told to count from the Tekufa, from the time of the circuit. Nowhere are we told to count from an equinox. The word Tekufa has never meant equinox. But briefly, let us talk about what equinox is and what it isn't. The word equinox means literally equal night. It is not the day of equal portions of day and night, however. It is rather the time period when the sun passes over the equator. And it refers to an astronomical point in time that must be calculated with advanced algorithms and trigonometry. And the ancients were not able to calculate the equinox in the way and the method that it is done today. They did it with observation. They used sundials and sun clocks. And on a sundial, there are 2 to 3 days when the shadow appears to be at 0 degrees, which would mark the time frame that people call the equinox. I know this because several years ago I constructed a sundial, and I have been observing it and charting it. And I know that around this time period, there is 2 to 3 days that appear to be on degree 0, which would be the time period of the equinox. But what people don't understand is to even create a solar clock or a sundial, you would have to be able to calibrate it correctly. In other words, if you wanted to build one today, what you would probably do is use a graphics calculator or go on the internet and get an advanced formula for your lines of inclination and declination so that you can have the length of the shadow that will tell you which time period during the solar year you are in due to the length of the shadow. Now again, this would take advanced mathematics. If you did not have the skills for this advanced mathematics, you would have to observe and chart the time frame of many years to even get an idea of when the middle portion, the 0 degree marker, should be. I've heard people say, well, all you have to do is stick a stick in the ground and you can determine when the equinox is. Well, my friends, it's actually much more difficult than just that. And another way that you could actually observe this time period would be that you would watch the sun as it rises and it sets. And you would see when it gets to the maximum point when it should be that time period of the equinox. And you can chart this, but it's very, very difficult to do. And again, it is very, very advanced. And nowhere in the Torah are we commanded to do this or to use this as a method for charting time. But we know that these signs do happen around this time period. And there are many signs that happen around this time period because, again, the sun, moon, and stars are bringing about signs for the seasons. So there are so many things that we can look at. But first, let's look at an example of the sundial in the scriptures. Because there are those who will point out that the sundial is generally used in pagan cultures, and this is true. However, a sundial is simply, when used in a kosher fashion, an acceptable fashion, there's nothing pagan about it. We see this in YaHuWaH, Isaiah 38, verse 7. It says, "And this is the sign to you from YaHuWaH, that YaHuWaH does the word which he has spoken. See, I am bringing the shadow on the sundial, which has gone down with the sun on the sundial of Ahaz, 10 degrees backwards." That's 10 hours back in time. "And the sun returned 10 degrees on the dial by which it had gone down." So YaHuWaH altered the calendar to be a sign, and he used the sundial for this oath, for this sign. So clearly, if the sundial was pagan, he would not have used it for the sign at all. Now there is another sign that one could use to tell the time frame of the beginning of the year, and this is by using the sign in the heavens of the sun passing through the 12, sometimes 13 constellations that go across the ecliptical plane. Again, this is what people have called the zodiac, but in Hebrew we call this Mazzaroth. And we know that the first constellation of the year is always Aries, is always a picture of the ram. And that picture of the ram is a picture of the Passover. Let's look at an example of Mazzaroth in the Hebrew scriptures in the book of Job, chapter 38, verse 31. It says, "Do you bind the bands of Kemah or loosen the cords of Kesel? Do you bring out the constellations?" This word is Mazzaroth, referring to those 12 constellations that go across the ecliptical plane, a picture of Israel, a picture of Yasharel. "Do you bring out the Mazzaroth, the constellations, in its season, or do you lead the bear with its sons? Do you know the laws of the heavens, or do you set their rule over the earth?" So here we see clearly that YaHuWaH has created the Mazzaroth, that clearly they tell a story, that clearly they are a picture of something in the Shamayim, a great sign that he has created because he created the lights for the appointed times. So this is very essential in our understanding because this will tell us the proximity of the beginning of a year. Now there is some confusion about the Mazaroth, because in modern times there is a way that people use the Mazaroth that is pagan, obviously, but they also use it in an astronomical fashion, which makes the timing slip because of the tilting of the earth. Instead of Aries appearing in the beginning of the month, it appears that it's Pisces. But that is not how the ancients would have calibrated the agricultural year. You see, the ancients used a method called the tropical Mazaroth. Today, what many have used is the sidereal Mazaroth, and there's a difference. See, the sidereal Mazaroth is based on what constellation the sun appears to be in currently at a given time period. Whereas the tropical Mazaroth is calibrated to restart at the beginning of the seasonal year. So by this method, Aries, the ram, is always number one. It's always the first one because it will calibrate according to the agricultural year and the solar year. So this is very crucial to understand. Now, those who say that we should use the equinox to begin our year usually point out two examples, and I want to go through those really quickly. They point out Genesis chapter 8, verse 13, because it speaks of the beginning of a year. And it says, "And it came to be in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked and saw the surface of the ground was dry." So the argument is, how did Noah know that it was the first day of the first month of the first year? And the answer is really simple. It doesn't say he did. It says, see here clearly, if you read this in context, this is YaHuWaH speaking to Moses, to Moshe. And he is narrating what has happened in the past to Moshe and giving it to him by revelation. And he is writing it down in the book of Genesis, or the book of Bereshith. Because it says, "And it came to be in the 601st year, in the first month, on the first day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth, and Noah removed the ark." So clearly, Noah didn't refer to himself in the third person. This is YaHuWaH speaking about Noah. So it doesn't say he knew the beginning of the year. And what we should really be amazed about is that Yahuwah Elohim told Noah by revelation to build an ark, that Noah was successful in building an ark, and that he was able to spare his life and the life of his family and the life of many animals on this ark. And clearly, if he has done all this, we know that YaHuWaH speaks to Noah. So if Noah needs to know when the time of the year is, YaHuWaH Elohim can tell him. He did not have to have a sundial on the ark. He did not have to have the sun at all. All he had to have was that direct communication that he had with Yahuwah Elohim. So it is very important to understand this, because this does not change anything. Just because there is not a beam on the ground because there was a flood does not mean the sun, moon, and stars are not still working together to create a year, and that Yahuwah Elohim would know when that year began. Also, people have pointed out the nation of Yasharel, of Israel, when they're in the wilderness. They say, well, Yasharel wasn't growing any barley, so how did they know when the beginning of their year was? But again, this is not that great of an argument, because we have to remember that Yahuwah Elohim had brought them out of Mitzrayim, out of Egypt, with a mighty right hand. And he had actually divided the waters of the Red Sea so that they could cross on dry land. We know that Yahuwah Elohim went before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, and that he spoke to them from Har Sinai, from Mount Sinai, the Ten Commandments. He was speaking to Moshe face to face, according to the Torah, giving his revelation of his instructions, which are the Torah, to his people. So if Yahuwah Elohim wanted his people to know during this time period when the beginning of the year is, he would have just told them, because that's what he did. He was speaking to them, constantly revealing these principles to them while they're in the wilderness. So he would not have allowed them to fail. He would not have made them use an equinox. He would not have made them use any type of sundial to chart this. Even though a sundial can chart this, that is not what is happening in the wilderness. Now, many people who use the equinox have said that it has to be the new moon that happens after the equinox. But nowhere in the Torah does it say to shamar the Tekufah, or that Tekufah even means equinox for that matter, and that we're supposed to look for it and go by the new moon after. There's nowhere in Scripture. But rather what we do see is that it would be the new moon closest to this time period between the time of the equinox and the equinox. Around this time period, that if you want your Passover to land definitely in the spring, definitely in the solar year, the beginning of the solar year. So it wouldn't have to be the new moon after the equinox. It's the new moon closest to this time period that today is called equinox. But again, remember, it could be 2 to 3 days. So it's not affixed to a certain day. But it's the new moon that happens closest to, whether that new moon be before it or on it or after that event. And the reason that is important is because if you went by the equinox alone, remember that all the Torah tells us to go by 2 or 3 witnesses, and we have many witnesses. We have the sun going through Aries. We have the seasons changing. We have the Abib on the earth. We have the sun projecting the shadow on 0 degrees, showing about the time frame of the equinox. There are many, many signs that you could go through and observe during this time of the year to make sure you have the true beginning of the year, the true Abib. But nowhere does it say to just use the Tekufah. Nowhere does it say to just use the equinox. And if you said, well, we have to use the equinox, and it has to be the new moon after the equinox, you run into a major problem. Because let's say the new moon happens the day before the equinox. This means you would postpone your observation of Abib for an entire 30 days. And what's going to happen is on a sundial, it's no longer going to look to be that you are in the first section of the solar year, but that you are rather in the second section of the solar year. And if you look at the constellations, no longer are you going to be in Aries, which is the first constellation. You're going to be in the second constellation. And this happens for the 7th month as well. And I've charted this for many years, and it definitely happens. So you don't want this to happen. You want the solar year and the lunar year to work together. You want most of your solar year, the beginning of your solar year, to land in that lunar year. So in other words, to make it real simple, is that it can be the new moon before, on, or after the time period that today is called equinox. It can be any of those time periods. We just want to make sure that it is the one closest to the time period where these things happen, where Aries comes into the sky, where the equilux and equinox are happening, where all these events transpire. That's what we want, to make sure it happens closest to this time period. So if you want to use the equinox as a point of reference, just know that throughout the scriptures and throughout the history, what we see is that it can be the new moon before the equinox that starts the year. There's no place in the Torah that says otherwise, and there's no place in the history that says otherwise. Let's look at a few examples in history. It says in the section of the Babli Sanhedrin in Sanhedrin 12b, again we were reading from this earlier, it says, if there are 16 days short in the case of Tekufah before Passover, then a month is intercalculated. This is not so in the case of Tekufah before Sukkot. So if they're using the Tekufah before the Passover, if it looks like there's going to be 16 days and there's not going to be a Tekufah, there's not going to be a restart, there's not going to be any Aries in the sky, there's not going to be a time period of the equilux or the equinox, and none of these events are going to happen, you need to add 30 days is what he's saying. You want to add 30 days. If you want to use the equinox as a point of reference, that's fine here. But just know that it's got to be the one closest to. And if it's the one closest to, the barley will always work. It'll always fit. You want to use barley as your primary source, not the equinox. It never says equinox, but it does say use the barley. But here again, it says that the Tekufah has to happen, and when it happens, you want the new moon that's closest to that period of time. Another example in this section of Rosh HaShana 21a says, when you see the Tekufa will extend to the 16th day of Abib, declare that year a leap year without hesitation. So you want your Passover, which happens on the 15th, to land around the time period of the Tekufa of the year, of the circuit of the year, which can be charted by looking at the sun as it rises in the various constellations. You want it to rise with Aries. So if you look and you see that this is not going to happen for 16 days, and your Passover is going to land in the dead of wintertime, then you must add a moon of days. All right. Now, there's another section that says, Rabbi Judah said in the name of Samuel, a year is not to be made intercalculated unless the Tekufa is short of completion by the greater part of the month. Now again, this is to make it simple. What he's saying is that you want the new moon closest to Tekufa. So if you want to go by the idea of Tekufa being the seasons of the year, if you look and you see that there's no way you're going to have barley, and you know you're not going to have barley for 16 days, then you've got to push it back. You've got to push the year back. If you're looking at the signs in the heavens and you see that there's not going to be Aries for 16 days, you want to push the moon back. In other words, you want the moon that is closest to Tekufa. If you're going to use the equinox as your Tekufa, you want the new moon that's closest to, not the one that's after specifically. You can throw off your entire celebrations by a month throughout the whole year if you do it this way, and it will be wrong before Yahuwah. You will come before Yahuwah not with Abib, but with grain that has already gone to seed. You will come before Yahuwah late, and you will even risk not having the ingathering at the end of the year if you do this a month late. It's very, very critical to get this timing just right. Now, in Josephus, Antiquities 3, chapter 10, verse 5, it says, in the month of Xanthicus, now he's speaking to the Romans to give them an idea of what Abib is. He says, in the month of Xanthicus, that's the Roman date, which is by us called Abib, and is the beginning of our year, on the 14th day of the lunar month, when the sun is in Aries. For in this month it was that we were to be delivered from bondage under the Egyptians. The law ordained that we should every year slay the sacrifice which I before told you we slew when we came out of Egypt, and which was called the Passover. And so we celebrated the Passover in companies, leaving nothing of what we sacrificed till the day following. So here we got a very beautiful piece of information from the great historian Josephus, and he says that the idea of Aries links up with Abib, which is the barley. So somehow they link up together. Now let's look at a quote from the Encyclopedia Judaica about the idea of how the zodiac or the Mazzaroth works, and how the idea of Aries begins according to the history of the Yahudim. Now it says, the zodiacal sign of this month, speaking of the month of Abib, is Aries. In the 20th century, Abib, in its earliest occurrence, extends from March the 13th to April the 11th, and its latest from April the 11th to May the 10th. And this is the section of Nisan in volume 12 in the Encyclopedia Judaica. But what's important is that here they're referencing the beginning of their year happening before the equinox. It says that the earliest occurrence of Abib can be anywhere from March the 13th to April the 11th. Even on the modern Yahudi calendar, the Jewish calendar, if you look at the Hillel 2 calendar, you will see that Abib does not have to happen after the equinox. I've heard some people say, well, that's what the modern Jews do. That's what the Yahudi people do. So that must be what we need to do. But that's not even what they're doing. In the Hillel 2 calendar, you see, if you look at the years 1975 through 2005, you will see that the month of Abib started before the equinox 9 different times. And this is important because this serves as an additional historical witness, because this was instituted in the 4th century, pointing to what was happening in the 1st century, and gives us a direct link. And we use all the history, and we use all the Torah. We see the beautiful picture of the beginning of the Rosh HaShana, the head of the year. That it does not have to be before the equinox, but rather it is based off the observational method of charting the seasons specifically. I've talked about the Mazaroth. I've talked about the wheel of the stars in the heavens and how the sun goes through these various stars throughout the heavens and gives us a sign on the earth. I have talked about the idea of the Tekufah. I've talked about the idea of the circuit of the year and the Abib and all these things, but it must be understood that the primary method for observing the beginning of the Rosh HaShanah, the head of the year, in the scriptural calendar that YaHuWaH gave us, is to look for the new moon that happens during the time where there is visible Abib, when you can see the Abib. And in the stars, you're going to see a sign of the ram, of the Passover lamb. You're going to see all types of signs of life during this time. But the most accurate way to know when to begin the year is with the Abib, because we cannot appear before YaHuWaH, our Elohim, empty-handed. But according to the Torah, it must be understood that nowhere are we told to observe the equinox, that Tekufah, the circuit, doesn't even mean equinox. But what we are told to look for is the change in the seasons that will be declared by the sighting of the barley. And yes, there will be signs in the heavens above as well, as the sign of the Passover lamb will rise in the sky with the sun. But the primary thing that we should be looking for is the Abib in the land of Yasharel, because YaHuWaH Elohim has warned us, do not come before me empty-handed. So let us do what the Torah tells us to do, and shamar et Chodesh HaAbib. Look for and guard the Chodesh, the new moon, in the Abib. I pray that you will continue watching this series as we go further into the Feast of YaHuWaH. In the next section, we'll be talking about the Passover and unleavened bread. Shalom, shalom.
I will give you praise.